Welcome back to How Could We, your podcast journey with EIT Climate-KIC, where we ask ourselves, how could we achieve a climate-resilient, inclusive and beautiful future for all? I'm your host, Anne-Sophie Garrigou, and whether you're returning or joining us for the first time, I'm thrilled to have you here for another conversation. In our previous episode, we talked to Annie Suliustriovaci, who is a community grant maker of the Systems Innovation Learning Partnership, an initiative funded by the Swedish Development Agency, SIDA, and designed by us at Climate-KIC. But before we dive in, let me introduce you to my co-host for this season, Sola Dofonias-Dottir. Hi, Sola.
Hi, Anne-Sophie. Thanks for having me.
So, Sola, you are the head of Learning, Mail and Impact at EIT Climate-KIC, and this season we're talking about development funding. In the last episode, you introduced us to the Systems Innovation Learning Partnership, and now we want to hear about the impact of shifting power in development funding. So can you tell us a little bit more about what your team has learned implementing that program and how unconscious bias around design and implementation can be avoided?
We've learned so much with challenging ourselves, doing things differently in all aspects of the Systems Innovation Learning Partnership. So within the program, the Experimentation Fund has given us a really good opportunity to test out and make little experiments and kind of experiment with the process itself of what is it that can be changed, could be changed in the funding environment and with the funding process from A to Z, basically. And I think that in that way, there's a lot of unconscious assumptions, biases that can influence the allocation of funding that allocates or affects of how we evaluate how projects led by individuals or organizations from different backgrounds can face biased evaluation criteria or different judgments. We also have a tendency of looking for the kind of best outstanding instead of looking across what are the potentials of any type of experiment. And this is a couple of the things that we have been working on.
So I know the SEAL project has a microgrant concept. Can you tell me a little bit about the key considerations in crafting the microgrant concept to ensure its effectiveness? Why did you choose to go through that route? And what did you realize crafting the program?
Yeah, so the microgrants were essentially small amounts of money given to people with promising experimental ideas that allowed them to take the first steps in further developing their ideas with no commitment for them to have to go ahead with things. I think we realized that we were not going to be able to fit our experimental approach into kind of an existing frame. And this was yet another thing that we wanted to play with when we were deciding to create a new framework that allowed for experimentation, innovation, and the maximization of learning.
Is it too simplistic to say that basically the SILP program didn't restrict how the money could be used and that it gave recipients the freedom to use it in the best way for the project simply without any tide attached, or more complicated than this?
I don't think it's necessarily too simplistic, because this is essentially what we were trying to do. We were trying to honestly give the recipients that freedom, like you say, to use the microgrant for the best way. How could they continue to develop their idea without worrying too much about money? And instead of us focusing on getting kind of a specific result of the money spent, we focused on the value that these microgrants brought to the applicants and their idea, even though we didn't force the recipients to apply for more funding later on. So this gave them the freedom to explore and learn from their experiments without pressure. And I think in many ways, by doing this, we took that first step of showing that our initiative is not about just giving out money and checking results. It's about real investment in relationships and investment in potential. We're partners in this process, and we're helping creating the opportunities for learning and innovation for everyone.
This is really interesting, and it completely changes the experience for the people who receive the funding, right? So that's what we want to talk about with our guest today. We're about to welcome Kanika Verma and Chatrand Patara, or PAT. So Kanika and PAT work with Development Alternatives, which is an organization in India that is looking at safe and green mobility through a network of women-led electric rickshaw.
development alternatives are great, and we have certainly also learned a lot from them in their participation here. Their experiment is fascinating, and in its aims to address the economic and social disempowerment of women due to lack of mobility. It's really around exploring the impact of e-mobility solutions, not only in terms of transport, but in livelihoods, in strengthening the local ecosystem. And their project was wanting to experiment with the e-mobility network as an investable model for replication. And I think that they can tell us a little bit more about that. But what I also think was fascinating and powerful for us was the way that they also took upon the sort of ways of working and the ways of sharing across the community of experiment. I'm also curious to step into the conversation and discuss this with them.
Okay, let's bring them in. Thank you. Hello, Pat. Hello, Kanika. Welcome to How Could We? And thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to talk to you. So we've said a few words about you in the introduction, but can you please tell us a little bit about you, your background, and tell us a little bit about your project and what issues it addresses?
Thank you, Anne-Sophie. It's a pleasure to be with you. My name is Pat, actually Srashtant Patara, Pat just for short. I'm the CEO of Development Alternatives, better described as part of the furniture because I've grown with the organization for the last 36 years. And my abiding interests are, of course, sustainable development, but more specifically entrepreneurship that leads to action at scale.
Thanks, Anne-Sophie. It's a pleasure to be here. Of course, my introduction to the number of years I've been at Development Alternatives will pale in front of Pat, but I was originally in the private sector 14 years ago, joined Development Alternatives, decided to do something different with my life. And I've been leading the work of green and inclusive entrepreneurship at DA. And let me tell you a little bit about the project as well. It is a safe mobility project, which is centered around an ecosystem of e-rickshaws. E-rickshaw is a tuk-tuk, and it's basically a three-wheeler. It's battery charged. First and foremost, the objective was to remove the cultural barriers that exist where women are not able to not only step out of their house, sometimes because of lack of safe mobility, but are actually now champions of safe mobility. The second objective was to look at a systemic change within the institutional structures that exists in the community, whether it's the transport office, or it's the real receivers of safe transport, such as women entrepreneurs, schools, nursing schools, as well as hospitals. And if we could create an ecosystem where they started accessing the safe mobility solution. And the third objective for us was also to look at new kinds of enterprises and solutions that could emerge because of now demand being placed because of these e-rickshaws. One example would be a battery charging plant being run by women that would enable not only just 100 women, which was the purpose of this project, to run e-rickshaws, but also unlock it for many more women in the future. So the project is basically a green and safe mobility project for women, led by an e-rickshaw network. At the heart of it, it's actually a project about women deciding or choosing the future they want to create, where mobility is no longer a challenge. It's a major issue in most parts of India where women do not have access to safe transport. And not only does it inhibit them from making choices for their livelihood, but also inhibits them from doing recreational activities as well. And that's what the project is about removing this constraint so that women can create the future they want, the future they deserve.
This project is sort of emblematic of what we do at Development Alternatives. The areas in which we, look to create impact are first of all about people, inclusive entrepreneurship and livelihood security, and then also climate resilience with a lot of resource efficiency thrown into it. And it's this kind of local action with people's collectives done at scale, which is what our organization is all about. And that's how we look to contribute towards impact in terms of sustainable development.
Thank you. That's really interesting. So in this series of podcasts, we're going to talk about development funding, and we're going to have a conversation around this later. But I wanted to ask first, what made you want to apply to the Systems Innovation Learning Partnership?
When we looked at the opportunity, the SILP call for proposals, I think what attracted us to it immediately and was the underlying idea that if you are looking at impact at scale, it cannot be done by a collection of projects, howsoever large, because those are based on one-to-one relationships between a donor and an implementing agency. And it doesn't matter where the money might be coming from, there's only so much that can happen. For impact to happen at scale, you need learning around a particular innovation to be put together and then transferred to a much larger body of actors. And that's what we felt was the essence of the systems innovation learning partnership, and just seemed like a very attractive opportunity, which is normally not funded. There are very few donors who place adequate emphasis on learning from an innovative process.
I'm happy that you say that, because I think that that's one of the sort of inquiry that we had, and what we wanted to explore is what happens when we actually come at it, not in that linear way, but that we are really focused on weaving things together. So we're really excited to have you here today and in this conversation, because I think that your project is, first of all, fascinating, and that's really the type of activities that our fund exists to support. Can I ask maybe how did the fund and its approach enable action on the ground in the project?
I think first and foremost, it enabled us to do deep listening, go deeper into the value systems that exist, and not just the behavior, and go and understand what is driving that value system. Not only were we able to listen deeply to the communities, but we were also able to navigate the women and the other stakeholders to listen to each other. The second, of course, connected point to that is creating a learning space within communities. Only a project which is about learning and experimentation would you be able to do that. That is fascinating to be part of, because while we were creating this learning space within the communities, we were also a learning space with the other cohort members. And that sort of started influencing the way we would approach each of the levels of learning. And I think third was to be able to connect to each of the points in the system and enable the women to come up with solutions themselves. And it's fascinating to see the kind of solutions that communities would come up with. No longer were the problems just roadblocks, but they actually became opportunities for change. And there are several examples that I could share, but I'd like to highlight three of them. One was we were able to understand very, very deeply the kind of challenges that existed with the stakeholders in unearthing safe mobility. And we started connecting the real structures, the institutional structures that existed, to solving the problems. We created platforms where not only were women able to have dialogue with stakeholders, but solutions started coming up. There is actually no proper licensing for e-rickshaws in the areas that we're working with. And may I just add that the women who are running the e-rickshaws are the only women e-rickshaw drivers in that entire community, and there are hundreds of them now. And because of the lack of licensing, the women would continue to have roadblocks in terms of fines or other kinds of challenges. They actually worked it out with the local transport system. They were able to influence them. They came up with a solution which was in the form of a certificate. So they were able to not only come up with a solution within themselves, but influence the larger system that can unlock the safe mobility challenge for other women now to set up this business. So there are several examples that can be shared.
the difference between what we were able to do in the SILP project vis-a-vis not being able to do it in other projects, which is to dedicate resources or set up the processes with which not just people in development alternatives or our local NGO partners, but stakeholders from within the community were able to learn about how to engage with a larger system, the environment around them. How do you understand who the actors are? How do you understand the opportunities, the risks that exist in that larger system, and then how do you engage with them to fulfill the goals that have been set by the community? The example that Kanika gave was just one of them. How do you move from driving around without licenses to actually having proper licenses which provide a huge amount of security to the women who own the battery powered rickshaws?
So I'm really curious in terms of the project that you have and this initiative and what you have been learning about kind of creating that community and ecosystem of these women, empowering them. I'm wondering, what have you learned about yourself with the community of grantees within the SILP learning cohort? Is there something, some insights? What have you learned in this process around being in this ecosystem of learners?
One of the most important things we learned was the idea of similarities. And over time, while we might think that each organization has distinct challenges and these distinct challenges need to be dealt with in a unique way, there are underlying factors that are systemic in nature that are actually common, across the challenges or the experiments that were run by, various organizations in the cohort. And you can move from an understanding of local lessons to meta lessons that enable you to think in a different way and to, if you're looking forward, to develop programs in a different way. And I think this is very, very important also from the point of view of donors. Donors at one level would like things to be context specific, but at another level, they can't deal with too many different situations. Right. And the kind of frameworks within which donors would want to give out funds have to be fairly consistent, across geographies, across types of organizations. There were also a few really unique things which don't happen. Normally, even when we're talking about the learning framework, the overriding perspective with which it's looked at is monitoring, evaluation, and then some kind of learning. And this is something, that Kanika's extremely passionate about, which is how do you take learning out of the monitoring and evaluation kind of frame?
Yeah, I think apart from having that space to collectively do some sense making, I think if I were to dig a little bit deeper into what this enabled us to do, I'd say that, to be able to share your hopes and aspirations, to be vulnerable with each other. And I'm going to add the Climate-KIC team as part of our cohort, because that's what it was about. You no longer had that kind of relationship. They were part of our learning team. And it just brought you a totally different perspective about the challenges that each of the actor faces. And that perspective enabled us to do a deeper kind of work in each of our communities, and also embrace the complexity in so many ways that each of us are dealing with.
This actually is really interesting because it brings us to the question of the relationship, right? This kind of fund completely changes the power dynamics between the donors, the grantees. I don't even know if we should use those terms or if we've come up with other terms, but can you tell us if you've noticed anything different in terms of the relationship between the grant giver, Climate-KIC, and your team because of the way the fund was designed?
It's very clear. We we never saw Climate-KIC as a donor. We saw Climate-KIC more as a learning partner. I mean, the money might have come through Climate-KIC, but that's almost incidental in terms of the way the project was designed and the processes that were followed. For all practical purposes, the donor, was sitting somewhere else. We never felt that. And as Kanika was saying earlier, it creates a new kind of relationship that makes experimentation possible. But then experimentation happens in lots of projects. And I think the difference here is that it makes learning about experimentation the centerpiece. And that, I think, is quite rare.
Yeah, if I may add, I think it's not just about disrupting the vertical relationship between a donor and a grantee, but I think a lot of us talk about it. It can be very sentimental, but to actually put it in action, a lot of us don't have access to the tools to build then horizontal relationships with even other actors in the ecosystem. And I think that was extremely significant. So the project was not just about enabling or giving funds for a certain type of approaches to be used, that you can learn and experiment, but to be able to actually have access to tools that every step of the way enabled us to connect to each other. That was extremely important because that's something that we'll walk away with in the future. Not just what we learned, but the fact that we will be able to now decontextualize the learning and use these tools in different programs and enable many more micro movements of change.
If I can maybe reflect a little bit here, and Sophie, on sort of what I'm hearing, and I'm really moved by what you're saying, because I think for us as the SILP team, we were very conscious about wanting to learn together, and that one of the ways of us trying to do something different here was for us to step into a bit more of a vulnerable position of saying, this is for everyone's learning. This is also for our relationship building and our growth. And that was not always easy because we are also used to some specific roles, and it's very easy to go into, we play the sort of roles and the dance steps that feel so well trained and well kind of oiled, because we've all known and we know what it feels like to sit in this specific role, to be in the grantee position or be in the grantor position, and being conscious of, we're actually here to try to be curious together on what can we learn from all different sides, what can we improve, tweak, think about differently from all kinds of different sides. And for me, that's the thing that has been very interesting for us to harvest our own learnings of what happens when we also get, you could say, a little bit more personal. And that takes time and energy, but it yields a different type of tonality in conversations. And for me, that is also something that I would hope that we spend more time investing on, because I think that that's where we can innovate some of those, you could say, transactional or linear relationships that we are currently dancing in because the dance steps are so well known.
Absolutely. The need for participants in the learning partnership to also undergo change is very important. And I can, imagine how it might have been difficult for you in Climate-KIC. If you look at it from the perspective of our team members, I think there's an interesting dynamic of, interacting with people from Europe, which, for Kanika or me, wasn't really difficult because, we've done it for years and years. But for some of our younger team members, we saw that transition. In the early stages of the project, they were, for want of a better word, deferential, because it's someone from Europe, someone who's probably higher up, who knows more about sustainable development. I mean, those kind of perceptions, which over time change to a more equal relationship where members in the team realize that they can have a conversation among equals, whether it's someone from the Climate-KIC team or it's someone from other members of the learning cohort.
I think, Sona, you've pointed out something that's at the heart of real change. We see a growing complexity in the world that we're living in. The problems have not become less. And yet we have to see a different role for ourselves. And I think this is a step in that direction. We can no longer continuously be present with communities who are really at the forefront of these challenges. And our role, I think, has to be more facilitated. And it's very, very important for us to understand that, because it's their narrative. We are just a facilitator in that narrative. They're actually learning, and we're trying to make sense of what the communities are learning. And as our role recedes more and more so, and the communities take more ownership of the solutions, I think we'll live in a much better world than we do so now.
I'm happy that you highlight this part around us consciously holding the learning space together. So that, yes, we had a big emphasis on facilitating learning and convening around learning, but in a way where it's a joint responsibility of holding that learning space together. And that sort of comes back to Pat's comment earlier around evaluation, monitoring, and then learning. But when you put the learning in the forefront, there's actually something that happens also around the evaluation and monitoring space. And I think we found that because we owned this space in many ways together. And I think that was extremely powerful for us as well. And I think what I'm excited about and curious about is this ability of constantly training the muscle of holding something together. Not being so afraid of the messy kind of bleeding over or sort of messy boundaries of roles, that trusting in that's something that is possible to navigate together. I think that is really something that from our side, we are eager to continue to explore.
Yeah, this is really, really interesting. I was wondering, how did the emphasis on the experimentation within the fund contributed to the project's success?
I think the project allowed us not to be boxed in. And two things happened because of that. One, new insights emerged. And the second, new solutions emerged that we wouldn't have thought so about before. New perspectives, new insights got picked up. I still remember this conversation that really touched me in so many ways with the women who are part of the Safe Mobility Network, where one of them said, because I've been part of this group from the beginning, I have noticed a change, which is that there's actually men in the community have started drinking less. The issue of alcoholism is being resolved. And I asked her, I said, why did she think so? And what kind of data points did she have? She said, because I've now been part of this cohort, we've been dealing with this together, I've had enough conversation and I can see this around me. And I think that happens because when a woman steps out of the house, even a man feels, if she can do something that's totally transformative, then what am I doing with my life? And that sort of insight was something that sort of emerged from the whole community themselves. They had come up with it. So that space, to have that space to be able to connect to the community constantly, really couldn't have happened. Those insights couldn't have emerged because of that. I think new solutions emerged where women realized that they have agency. They have decision-making power and are no longer receivers of something, and started coming up with solutions such as creation of a platform where they will bring different actors together to solve the safe mobility problems. That really got them to be part of any kind of transportation issue in that community and not just about the project itself. I think the second solution that emerged was actually formal MOUs with schools and health centers, where young schoolgirls who were dropping out because they didn't have access to safe mobility, and because the parents now had a faith in the network, they were the ones who worked it out with the women and the schools to create this sort of more formal system where women were taking the schoolgirls to their home and back. And I don't think that kind of a solution would have emerged by us thinking about it. And I think that's what the experiment allowed us to do.
If I could make a quick addition in a very, very simplistic way of what would have happened to our work in Mirzapur on e-rickshaws if we did not have, the SILP project, the learning processes, I don't think we would have gone deep, and neither would the women or the other people involved in this would have gone deep into their own environment, and they would certainly not have looked beyond their own very narrow sort of system boundaries. And the fact that they could go beyond and go deep basically led to the emergence of new solutions that have created a more robust network of women e-rickshaw drivers in Mirzapur.
I think this is really interesting for me, having reported on a lot of climate innovation, climate projects before. And it just says how much the communities that benefit from monies from donors should be involved from the very start, because all of those things you mentioned, Kanika, like people who are setting those funds, they don't know what the reality is on the ground most of the time, right? And even you might not think of that. And I think it's it's a fantastic example of what the SILP or projects like the SILP can add.
I think it also underscores how, the SILP project had a cohort of learning partners of its own, but then it created a cohort locally among stakeholders who got into a learning and experimentation mode locally.
I'm just so happy and amazed by this project that you're doing, and I always get so touched when we're talking about it.
Thank you, Sola. Pat and Kanika, can you tell us a little bit about what's next for your project?
There's some amount of ambition because we want to go to the next system level. Kanika and her colleagues have already signed a memorandum of understanding with the UP State Rural Livelihoods Mission to set up 100,000 women-run enterprises over the next 2 years. And from the 110 odd, women e-rickshaw drivers we have in one location, within 6 months, that's supposed to grow 10 times across 5 other locations. But I think what's very interesting, again, from a learning point of view, is that we will have to understand and engage the next system level, which is essentially, the government machinery, other non-governmental organizations, financing agencies, suppliers, etc., to do this at scale. So we're quite excited about that, and the learnings will obviously be immensely useful.
What I'm really excited about is just seeing these set of change makers. A new whole set of change makers have emerged out of this experiment. These women, most of them who had not stepped out of the house themselves, they were behind the veils. Most of them are not even educated, decided to change their community. And the micro movements that they've created are now traveling to the new places that Pat was talking about. But they are now part of that movement, because what they are going to be doing is actually going to build capacities of other sets of e-rickshaw networks. And this again brings back to my point previously about who is the actor or who's the change maker in this world, because just given the opportunity to do so, we have a new set of actors and change makers. And I'm very, very excited about where this will go. I'm quite hopeful. It gives me a lot of hope of the kind of world we'll be able to build for young women and for women with this new set of actors.
Thank you. And this is just the theme of the podcast, right? How could we build a world that is more just and more climate resilient? And I think this sort of project with these change makers is exactly how. So I'm really also very grateful for the discussion we have. I just want to ask if there is anything you haven't mentioned before we go to the conclusion question.
There was an Indian author, V.S. Naipaul. He wrote a book called India, A Million Mutinies Now, which was an observation on India as a country. Kanika and I were talking about this probably 4 or 5 years ago, and she said, but this is precisely what we need. We need a million mutinies. And she'd coined the phrase or the word micro movements. So when we look at what happened in this experiment, we see and the results, the transformation that it's brought about, we see a huge amount of potential, but we're also now challenged by how can you use learning and how can you share learning, share knowledge, so that it can create a million mutinies, hundreds of thousands of micro movements, without or have impact at scale without getting straight jacketed, as happens often in India, into some kind of a scheme or a program. That, I think, is the next challenge that we have at hand.
The way we see micro movements of change is in these these communities, within their community, either they're unlocking critical resources themselves that they didn't have access to, or they're playing a new role that they did not have access to earlier, or they were too many power imbalances that inhibited them to do so, or there are local processes that are changing the way things are, where things are stuck, or there's a status quo, or fourth, which is that a new kind of solution or a new movement is a way of life. Seeing e-rickshaws in the streets of Mirzapur is a norm now, run by women. Earlier, there was not even a single one. And now, when they drive down, even the men look up and say, oh, wow, this can only happen in our community.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Okay, and now I have to ask this question that I ask every single one of our guests. What would a beautiful, just, and climate resilient future look like for you?
I look at a beautiful, just, and climate resilient future in terms of how empowered people are. And this might not be in terms of outcomes, but in terms of democracy, decentralization, control over resources, and the ability of people or local communities to influence larger systems.
I think for me, I imagine this world to be fair and where each one of us has equity into what the world will look like.
What an interesting project and what a great conversation we've just had. Sola, what will you keep from this conversation with Kanika and Pat?
Oh, so many things. I think for me, this conversation was so much about the encouragement of what can happen when we allow for pivoting, and where we continuously hold ourselves to account of not stepping back into linear thinking in our approaches of managing projects or project cohorts or grants. I think this sort of micro movements conversations around what are the movements that we all need to make from multiple different angles in order for us to shift things, and that it does take us creating movements out of the ordinary in order for us to be able to move forward. It's been amazing to see what they have enabled through their approach, and I got very inspired and touched when they also talk about what was possible for them because the definition of what they needed to deliver was not set, and how that enabled them to explore different opportunities.
Yeah, I really love also this idea of like micro actions and how like by replicating them, it's like a snowball, right? I think something that also was interesting to me, and that will bring us to my next question, is this idea that the way the fund was designed allowed for the community to have a voice in the design of the project, which is not even something they would have maybe imagined.
We need to pay more attention to relationships. So if we are designing in community with focus on relationships and what are we learning through relationships, it creates a ripple. That meaning that those that are in implementation in whatever context they are in, they are also focusing in on relationships and community building. And I think that for me in general, that would also be my hope and the wish that we together with others focus more on relationship building.
Definitely. And I hope this also inspire others to experiment with innovative ways to fund development projects. Before we close this episode, I wanted to ask you, how do you think we can motivate more organizations to join us in this experimentation, to collaborate, to learn, and to inspire each other to drive systemic change globally?
I think there's a lot of organizations and initiatives that are very willing and eager in exploring. I think what we need to do all of us is to take the next step to explore together. So how do we become better at really freely, generously sharing and experimenting together and building a kind of a tighter web of relationships? And how do we also together figure out what in the current setups of our systems is hindering us to collaborate, and how can we hack or create again micro movements towards connecting better?
Well, Sola, thank you for being an excellent co-host again. That was a very interesting conversation. And to all our listeners, thank you for tuning in. Check out the episode description for additional resources, and if you're eager to delve deeper into the project and reimagining of development funding.
And if you are one of those funders or practitioners interested in these questions and interested in scaling up and collaborating on these types of projects, then please get in touch with us.
Indeed, we will leave our contact information in the notes of the episode. In the next and last episode of this season, released next week, we'll be talking to another project recipient of the SILP Fund, and we'll be diving more again into the creation of the portfolio with Sola. So to ensure you catch the next episode, follow our podcast on your preferred platform and stay connected with Climate-KIC on social media. This podcast episode was produced by Barbara Mendes-George. Sola, thank you again. Until next time, bye.